What I think San Franciscans knew that this was a politician on the rise. She was elected the same time as Gavin Newsom was elected mayor. This was a new generation of politicians in San Francisco, and they were out to make their mark.
Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Rachel Myrow. I'm senior editor of KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk and your moderator for this evening. The club would like to thank the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting the Good Lit event. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Morain, author of Kamala's Way, An American Life. Please join me in welcoming Dan here to the stage. So just in case you didn't read the info before coming here tonight, Dan has covered California politics for more than 4 decades. He worked at the Los Angeles Times for 27 years and spent 8 years at the Sacramento Bee, where he was the editorial page editor. Dan wrote his first story about Kamala Harris in 1994 and has covered her career from the San Francisco District Attorney's Office to becoming the 2024 Democratic nominee for the President of the United States. Dan, welcome back to the club.
Well, thank you. Great to be here.
Well, I thought I would kick us off by talking about the fact that this book was not just published. It's been out for a few years, so bear that in mind as you're thinking, what has been going on in the White House, and how has she been doing as VP? This book stretches back behind. And also another interesting fact that I think we have to speak about right up front is the fact that it's an unauthorized biography. Explain for us, if you will, what that means.
Well, it means that Vice President Harris, then Senator Harris, didn't help with it. She didn't give me an interview. Her family didn't give me an interview. So that's it. They did not authorize it or approve it or anything like that. Not that they put roadblocks in the way. They just, this was written in the fall of 2020, and she was busy then. She was running for vice president, so I could quite understand why she wouldn't take the time out to talk to me for this biography.
She, as a general rule, has not been very transparent with the media. She doesn't share a lot. People who've worked with her are afraid to talk about it, even if they've left her employ. She's a very guarded politician.
Well, I think she's the public record is there. But in terms of her personal life, I think that's true, that she doesn't much talk about aspects of her personal life. It's her right. I don't blame her for that. And I don't think she blames us journalists for asking questions. She's very good at saying, no, I don't want to answer that question. And you can ask it 10 different ways, and she will say, no, I won't answer that. So she's very good at that. I do, but so much of her life is played out in public, right? I mean, we know what cases she handled for the most part when she was in Alameda County Deputy District Attorney, except for those that were in juvenile court. We don't know anything about those. And as District Attorney and Attorney General, so on. So her public record is out there.
She was born into a very liberal, progressive political milieu, but has clearly, over the course of her career, and it is an extensive career, tried to steer to the center. And I'm just wondering if that's something you observed as you were writing this book, going back over your old coverage. Could you see a sort of steady tack to the center?
Well, so aspects of her life and her opinion, I don't know, because I have never had the opportunity to ask her those questions. When she was running for Attorney General, which is really when I spent most time sort of getting to know her politics, I didn't think that she was going to be running for president in 2024, so I didn't think to ask these questions. So, there are aspects of her politics, her life, her opinions that I don't know. Like, for example, when she was at Howard University, it was in the anti-apartheid movement, and obviously it was a very big deal at Howard University. It was in the Reagan administration, the end of the Reagan administration and George Bush administration, or actually the Reagan administration, excuse me. And so she had to have had opinions about apartheid. My wild guess is she thought it was really a bad idea. But I don't know, I don't know what her involvement was in that. Without a doubt, she's surprised, and she wrote about this in her autobiography. She, without a doubt, surprised family and friends when she said that she was going to become a prosecutor. I think that surprised her family, but she also has an interesting explanation for that. Right?
Which is?
Well, one of the reasons goes back to her time in high school when a friend of hers, she talked about this in her acceptance speech in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, which was by far the most public she had been about this. But in high school, one of her best friends, maybe her best friend, a girl named Wanda, confided in her that she had been molested. And high school student Kamala Harris said, well, you've got to come stay with us and be protected by her mother, Shamala, and her sister, Maya. This is when they're living in Quebec, high school in Quebec. And then she explained in the run-up to the election in 2020 that this was one of the reasons that she became a prosecutor was to protect kids. It sounds like a pretty reasonable explanation. The New York Times wrote about it. She actually did a television or maybe a YouTube commercial around it, and then for Kamala's Way, we spoke to Wanda and got more detail, and so I write about it in Kamala's Way, and I've kept in touch with Wanda Kagan. Interesting, she was at the convention, and there was a shot during Harris's acceptance speech where the camera turned to Tim Walz sitting there cheering, and Wanda Kagan was standing right next to him. So her seat was right next to Tim Walz's.
When did it become pretty clear to the California press corps and perhaps the Democratic National Party that she had much bigger ambitions than, say, just becoming California Attorney General?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I didn't cover when she ran for district attorney in 2003 here in San Francisco. I was based in Sacramento, and 2003, as you recall, was the year of the recall of Gray Davis. So most political reporters, I would say, were focused on covering the recall of Gray Davis and the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2003. But I think San Franciscans knew that this was a politician on the rise. She was elected the same time as Gavin Newsom was elected mayor. This was a new generation of politicians in San Francisco, and they were out to make their mark. Now, without a doubt, when she ran for Attorney General in 2010, the Republicans knew that she was somebody that they would have to contend with. And so there was a political action committee called the Republican State Leadership Committee, which gained a great deal of attention because it had helped elect a bunch of Republicans to state houses all around the country, which then dominated redistricting and lead to the Republican Congress that we had for much of the 2010s. Anyway, that organization spent more than $1 million on an ad to derail Harris' first statewide election, understanding that if she won, she would be a player, certainly run for governor or senator, and maybe president. Right? One of the people I interviewed for the book, Kevin Spillane, who was the campaign manager for Steve Cooley, her opponent, told me that in the course of the campaign, he told Cooley, she's not really running for attorney general, she's running for vice president, right? So he could see it happening, that if she won that first statewide race, she would be somebody Republicans would contend with for years to come, and they clearly are.
Clearly ambitious from the start. Do you think, because you had a ringside seat to that race, I believe, do you think Steve Cooley thought that she was a lightweight? Did he underestimate her?
I think without a doubt, Cooley underestimated her.
No.
Without a doubt. And that has happened, I think, kind of throughout her career, that she's been underestimated. People lose who underestimate her, right? She started out when she was running for district attorney at 6 or 8% in the polls. Nobody thought that this upstart was going to win when she set out to run. But I think she thought she was going to win, and obviously persuaded some important San Franciscans that she was a contender here.
I have to ask, because if I don't ask it, somebody in the audience is going to ask it. Her relationship with Willie Brown. Explain for us what she got out of that beyond the frisson of their romantic entanglement.
Well, I don't know that it was an entanglement. I think they both had their eyes wide open. Mayor Brown, well, he was Speaker Brown when they met, and that's where I covered Mayor Speaker Brown when he was Speaker for the last few years of his tenure there in Sacramento. I think it was a real relationship, and it ended in 1995, at the end of 1995. She ran for district attorney in 2003, right? So 8 years later. Willie Brown is, from everything I know, from everything I've heard him say, from everything he's told me, is quite fond of her and admires her and thinks she's a terrific politician and a great talent. And of course, he helped. He opened doors. I mean, he did that for numerous other politicians, Gavin Newsom, Mark Leno, many other politicians in San Francisco. That's what power brokers do, and he certainly was a power broker.
And a kind of coach, a kind of mentor?
Yeah, well, she was there when he was running for mayor. She was in strategy meetings. She understood, who better to learn from than Willie Brown? He's a unique political talent. But then, beyond that, she wasn't elected because of Willie Brown. There are many other people who helped her along the way. Louise Rennie certainly was one. Andrea Dew Steele, people in the organization that was established with funding from Susie Tompkins Buell, founder of Esprit Clothing, to specifically promote women candidates, right? And so she came up through that organization. Many people helped her in that first race. She later said Willie Brown was an albatross. She got attacked in the campaign over that. It obviously didn't work. Voters, looked beyond that, past that.
A politically savvy friend of mine wrote me today when I was asking about talking to you. America doesn't need a plan for everything, just an idea of character, I'm presuming the character of the candidate, so we know what they will do behind closed doors. And this friend's definition of character is what you do when nobody is looking. Mm-hmm. Given that this was an unauthorized biography, do you feel you got a sense of Kamala Harris's character?
Well, I certainly knew people. I mean, one of the reasons why I think Simon & Schuster, was willing to take a flyer on me writing this biography was because I had known her. I interviewed her multiple times during the 2007-8 presidential campaign. She was Barack Obama's main surrogate in Northern California, and really one of only two notable elected official surrogates in California, the other being Eric Garcetti down in LA. And then I paid attention to her as Attorney General. It's just one of the things that I've did over my career was to pay attention to whoever the Attorney General was, going back to John Van de Kamp. It's a really interesting office, does an incredible amount of interesting work, so I paid attention to her. Do I know, in fine detail? Not particularly, but I do know, people who left her office, who were displeased, people who worked with her, who think the world of her. One of the striking things that nobody would have known, because she didn't advertise it. She's maybe a little more public about it now. But when the cameras weren't on, one of the people I talked to in the book talks about this instance where a local political activist, not a big name person, was at death's door at Laguna Honda here, and this mutual friend called Harris, D.A. Harris, and said, it would really mean a lot to this woman if you wrote a note to her. And Harris' response was, well, what are you doing now? Let's take a ride over there. So they took a ride over to this woman's bedside. She, spent 20 minutes with her, holding her hand, whatever it was she was doing. I have no idea what she said, but it was a moment when there were no cameras around, right? And she did that multiple times. I found it's kind of a through line in her life, where people are at the end of their day. She makes a point of talking with them, or when people lose a loved one. I was at the Democratic Convention and had an opportunity to talk to her first campaign manager, Rebecca Prozan, and Rebecca, she did this one campaign for Kamala Harris. They've obviously maintained contact over the years, but as vice president, she called Rebecca to condolences for the death of her mother. Well, that's not something that Harris put out a press release on. It's one of the things she did when no one was looking. So I find that kind of interesting, and maybe it explains one reason why Biden chose her. They have this sort of empathy thing going on, perhaps.
I'm curious if you detect a core political philosophy that operates with Harris, or is she more of a kind of Bill Clinton, which is, sensing which way the wind is blowing and going in that direction?
Well, I think, I don't know what she's going to do on, for example, tariffs, right? But I do know what she's going to do in the positions she's going to take on gun safety. I do know, and she's going to be all in on that, right? I do know what she's going to do as it relates to reproductive rights. This is core to her politics, and they've been there forever. You can't underestimate the impact of having spent, the better part of 2 decades being a courtroom prosecutor. I think she's, I think she believes in the power of redemption, and that's a real thing. But I also think she believes that people who commit crimes, need to spend a little time in prison, maybe a lot of time in prison. I think that's part of her belief system too, right? One of the things that she brought to the vice presidency that I'm pretty sure Mike Pence and Dick Cheney and Al Gore and all the way back never would have thought to bring to the vice presidency is the notion of maternal health care and maternal mortality and infant mortality, particularly among poor women and particularly among Black women. These are the sorts of issues, or that is an issue that I'm not sure would have gotten as much attention in the Biden White House had he not chosen Harris as his running mate.
I don't know if you read that recent op-ed in the New York Times by James Carville, but I thought I'd read out a couple of arguments and just see how you bounce them off you. Mm-hmm. The jury of public opinion on Donald Trump is settled. This is precisely Vice President Kamala Harris's greatest political advantage in the next 2 months. Mr. Trump eked out a win in 2016 on a blank promise to revive a relic of America. His argument basically, the blanker the promise of change, the more American voters, especially in swing states, are intrigued. Mm.
Yeah, so I did read James Carville's piece. There is no better organizing tool that the Democrats have ever found than Donald Trump. And so he will, he will energize the base in a way that she never could. That said, I was in Vegas watching her at that rally, and there were 14,000 people there, and she and Waltz were late. I think they were late. Certainly the DJ was vamping for time and playing way too many tunes. And I didn't see anybody leave, right? Maybe there were a few people who were overcome by heat, and the EMTs had to go help them. But there was 14,000 people in that arena, and they were, she lit them up. I mean, she just did. She's very good she's gotten better, but she's become very good on the stump, I think. You could always see that. You could see that in her debate performances here in California when she, the debate she had at the University of California at Davis School of Law in 2010. I was one of the panelists at that debate. And the debate she had at the University of Pacific in 2016 when she ran for U.S. Senate. I mean, she's very good. If anything, she's gotten better.
She can light up a room and raise money.
Well, she certainly can do that. She can raise, it helps being from California. It helps having connections in Silicon Valley, as you know. It certainly helps. She now is in her residence is in Brentwood in L.A. and Doug Emhoff, her husband, entertainment lawyer. So she certainly has backing from Hollywood, Silicon Valley, without a doubt. That's where the money is.
Absolutely, right? They call California the ATM of the political machine in the United States.
Right.
Of course, that can be very frustrating for a lot of Californians because the feeling is like, you come to us for money, but you don't want our opinions on anything.
Yeah. It is interesting. I spent a lot of time covering money in politics. that was my job in the 2008 presidential campaign, was to cover money and politics, and it's changed dramatically certainly in this presidential election, but small dollar donors really have just become the lifeblood of national politics in a way. They were under Obama. They actually were under Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, he was amazing at drawing small dollar donations, $5, $10, $25 via direct mail. Well, now it's via email and text. And my recollection is Obama, maybe 31% of his money came in small dollar donations. And Harris's, the last time I checked, was at 41%. And those are the dollars that really they so add up, and somebody who gives $10 today can give another $10 next month, and so on and so forth on through the election. So they're even more valuable than some of the big bundlers, the Hollywood types and the Silicon Valley types. So.
And I guess maybe I'm cynical thinking this, but something, a small donation or the percentage of small donations gives you a broader sense of how genuine the support is, because these are not people who expect that in return for their $10 or their $75
right.
that they'll see any policy swings moving in their direction.
Right, as opposed to the Silicon Valley.
They want something in return for that kind of money.
Clearly want
Yeah.
something, and
Yeah.
the crypto folks clearly want crypto friendly policy. We'll see how that turns out under Trump or Harris, whoever wins.
In the coming debate, Carville says, one good joke is worth 100 fact checks. How well do you think Harris does in sort of breaking away from the pack when it comes to the Democratic tendency to lecture?
Well, I think one of the things trial attorneys do is successful ones build a rapport with the jury, and jurors end up liking the lawyer who's presenting a case, who's going to be successful, I think. And so I think that in a debate, what I would look for from her is her building a rapport with the jury who's voters, right? And she isn't going to do that by being the village scold, right? That's just not what she's going to do. I mean, again, having seen her in debates, she smiles, she laughs a little bit, she gets in her punches. There's a lot of interesting give and take. I mean, I think she's a very good debater, and that's probably because she was a pretty good courtroom attorney.
She may not be flying like a butterfly, stinging like a bee, but still
Right.
pretty decent.
Right.
Naturally, just given what I do for a living, I'm very interested in her relationship to Silicon Valley. And I know it's hard for you to, spill the tea, especially about what's been happening in recent years. But because you're a California journalist, you've had the opportunity to see her, attend fundraisers and shindigs and schmooze. I mean, her brother-in-law, for goodness sakes, is a high up at Uber and in
General
political.
counsel.
Yes, right. Tony West. Yeah, we just said it there in stereo. But there are other people. The Obama campaign manager David Plouffe.
Plouffe, yeah.
Plouffe, I've mispronounced it there. Policy executive for Uber and Zuckerberg's philanthropic venture, former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder Jr., who's conducted audits for Uber and Microsoft, and then, of course, West. And I guess what I'm asking is, to what extent have you determined that, they really have her ear when it comes to whether and how to regulate Silicon Valley? Because we've seen from the Biden administration a really strong hammer, especially in the choice to have Lena Khan head the FTC. Do you have any sense which way Harris might bend?
Well, no, because I don't cover the White House, and I don't have a sense as to where she would go. But I would be surprised if she. I would be surprised if she reverses some of those Biden Harris administration positions. I should say, in my view, her most consequential case as Attorney General, she will say, I think it was the bank litigation. Yeah, it was interesting. Or maybe the for-profit college case against Corinthian. That was a big deal. That was a big deal. That made it smart. But the case that I find most interesting that she did, that she oversaw, was the one against Backpage.com. And so, for folks who aren't aware of it, Backpage.com was like Craigslist, only for prostitution. Far worse, there were children who were bought and sold over that platform. She brought she authorized her deputy, Maggie Krell, to bring a case against Backpage. The Backpage's defense was the same defense that X and Facebook and other social media use, that it's just a platform, it's just a bulletin board. It has no responsibility for what gets posted on its site, a 230 exemption, which you understand better than I do. Their position was, oh no, this is, what's going on here. And you're more than a billboard, and you've been warned multiple times. They ended up getting guilty pleas. They ended up shutting down Backpage. In my view, and against the wishes of many in the Silicon Valley who viewed this as treading on their turf. I don't think it was. Clearly, she didn't think it was. It's interesting. One of the speakers at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago was one of the victims of Backpage, and it was a 2-minute speech maybe, but it was a powerful speech, and she was bought and sold on this platform. Anyway, I think that was her most important case, and it went against the wishes of at least some in the Silicon Valley.
There's a big debate, if you will, between those who want regulation, which tends to be more rank-and-file American citizens, and those who don't, which tend to be the Silicon Valley elite,
right,
across the political spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, you'll know this better than I do, but there are people in the Silicon Valley who are all in for Trump. Clearly, Elon Musk is. I mean, not that he's of Silicon Valley any longer, but certainly has his roots there. Peter Thiel. And then there are those who are in Harris's camp, Reid Hoffman being one. So they're split. My guess is that the voters who are, the more rank and file will lean more heavily toward Harris than Trump, but I don't know.
Obviously, and I'll just say, I see our ushers moving through the crowd. So if you've got a question that you've written down on that note card, now is the time to hand it over to them so they can bring it up here and I can share the question with Dan. Because Conversely, if you haven't written anything, now would be the time to do it. And for those of you paying attention on YouTube, you can do that via chat, and I'll get that as well. So, it's she's had the opportunity, both as a senator and as vice president, to be on the national stage. But of course, when you're in the Senate, you're, a member of the chorus, you're not a soloist, right? When you're vice president, your job is to stand stalwartly behind the president and say, you tell the world what a great job he's doing. Do you feel like she has, the runway is so short to the election. Is she going to be able to tell American voters who she is, or is she just too much of an open question mark, especially for voters in the swing states?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the short runway, this truncated campaign, can help her and can hurt her. I mean, one way it certainly helped her is she didn't have to run in a primary and take positions that would be, take all the positions that you would have to take in a primary, as she did in 2019, where she was running against people who were to the left.
And so she had a lot of positions that were to the left that didn't work to her benefit.
Clearly
with
not.
That national audience.
Clearly not. And, it's going to be harder for Trump to define her, right? I mean, he's certainly going to try, and there's a ton of money that's being spent in those swing states to define her in the way he wants her defined. And her job is to tell her story. And you're right. I mean, that's obviously what it comes down to. That who's going to define her? People already know who Trump is. People have made up their minds about Trump. Nobody's going to be swayed by a 30-second spot one way or the other on Trump. Everybody's made up their minds. She's not quite a blank slate, but she's more of she's not fully defined in the minds of many voters, including many here in California, right? I mean, we don't pay a lot of attention to politics here. It's kind of one of the veins of the existence of a political reporter in California.
I was talking the other day to my hairdresser here in San Francisco, who's very politically engaged, very interested in all the issues, who complained to me with a fair amount of alarm that many of her clients, old and young, or perhaps I should say young and old, are just disconnected from politics. They've tuned out, perhaps because they have the privilege of being in a state where they feel comfortable, politicians more or less align with their values. They're just uninterested in the rough and tumble of national politics. And it just made her really worried. I suppose she doesn't have to be worried on Harris's behalf, because the fight's not here.
Right.
Yeah.
We're, she's going to win California by 3 million votes, maybe, right? I mean, there's no way that Trump is going to win California. But you're right, there are 7 states where it matters, 7 states, and it will come down to a few tens of thousands of votes in those 7 states, and it's precinct by precinct, block by block, county by county.
And she's already shown herself willing to be, shall we say, flexible in terms of her political positions. I'm thinking particularly of fracking.
Yeah.
When it comes to Pennsylvania, she was against it before she was for it, but her values haven't changed on it.
Right. Well, yeah. So I mean, her position on that. Again, this is I know her as a Californian. I know less about her in D.C., but from what I've read on fracking, she did cast a vote, deciding vote on fracking as vice president presiding over the Senate. So, whatever her position was during her short-lived 2019 presidential run, it's whatever you write, I guess, whatever Pennsylvania, the majority of people in Pennsylvania might hope, right? So Pennsylvania matters, big state.
Something I've been struck by as a reporter covering this particular race is that the younger the voter you talk to, the more likely that they're likely to be judging the presidential candidates based on one or two issues. I guess, the lingo is they're a single issue voter, like either you agree with me on this thing that's really important to me or you're dead to me.
Sure, climate change is one.
Climate change, Gaza, Israel.
I do think Gaza is one for, obviously, feelings are incredibly intense over Gaza. But if you look at the polls, it's way down on the list of issues that will sway voters in 2024. But for a number of voters, for a fraction of voters, it is the defining issue. So then the question is, Trump or Harris on that issue. That's what, you don't have a third choice here, right?
Yeah, it's not on the menu.
It's a binary choice.
If your concern is, getting the United States to stop funding military support of Israel, you don't have that choice on the menu.
I think that's probably true, yeah.
But do you think that concern over issues like that one, even with climate change, right? Democrats are ostensibly, or at least on paper, for taking the necessary steps, but easier said than done, and their other priorities seem to get in the way so many years now. Is there a risk that people who are really, really upset about these issues, justifiably so, might just stay home from the polls?
Well, no doubt. And especially young people. The issue always is how to get young people to vote. Well, the answer is they vote in far smaller numbers than their population would suggest, and therefore old people like me get to decide their future. Is that what they want? I don't know. I think I'm a benevolent person, but they may not think so. So, probably they ought to suck it up and go out and vote.
Well put. Well, we have some great questions here. I'm going to dive into them a little bit early, I think. One person asks, as a presidential candidate, what do you think is Kamala's biggest strength, and what is her biggest weakness?
I've thought about what her biggest weakness is, and I guess I'm not sure. It's going to kind of be in the eye of the beholder. Now, there will be people who will not vote for her. I think pollsters would say, because she's a woman, because she's Black and South Asian. There are people like that, but I don't know that they would vote for Biden either, right? There will be, what is her weakness? I don't know. I think she's a pretty good candidate. I think I also think that the feelings are so intense in this race. Trump is where he is. His ceiling is probably 47%, and hers might be 47.2%, right? He's got a, as they say, a low ceiling and a high floor. People are supportive of him, or are going to be supportive of him, even if he, eggs on an insurrection, even if he shoots somebody on Fifth Avenue. I hope he doesn't do that. And she, she has room to grow. I think her strength kind of is her story. It's an interesting story. It's a, pretty inspirational story. Parents from, India and Jamaica coming here to find a better life, to get higher education, and they get it, and they produce her and her sister, and in one generation here she is, at the doorstep becoming president. Well, that's a pretty inspirational story. So I don't know. I think that's a pretty good strength.
And, I also think, too, that there's a tendency, perhaps, for especially people who are not in California to think, a Democrat rising in primarily Democratic California, that's an easy stretch.
Right.
But California politics is pretty brutal business.
Well, it is. And so, you see this with former President Trump. What he's trying to do is to find some way to define her, as a communist. That's just silly. He called her dumb as a rock. Well, you can say a lot of things about Kamala Harris, but dumb she is not. He's
really grasping at straws, like there's a different criticism every week.
Yeah, well, he said this was an especially sexist one, that foreign leaders would view her as a play toy. Well, having been an editorial page editor when she was in for endorsement interviews when she ran for U.S. Senate, and I was deputy editorial page editor when she ran for Attorney General. This is a very tough person. Right? This is a person who, she's put people away in prison for a long time. She's not somebody who I just can't imagine she's easily rolled. I've known a lot of politicians. She's a pretty tough one. So.
This person asks, were you surprised with the VP pick of Governor Walz?
Well, sure. Who knew who Tim Walz was before he, went on television and started talking about how weird the Republicans were. I didn't know who she was going to pick. I took Biden at his word that he was going to run for re-election. I always thought he was going to run for re-election, so it shows what I know. But then, she comes up with this guy who, fixes cars and has Gus, her son, who, anybody who saw that and wasn't touched, I don't think you have a soul, right? Him saying, that's my dad. Good God. That was powerful stuff. And his daughter, Hope, with her, sign of the... Anyway, so, he may have some... I think it was a pretty good choice. What Barack Obama did was pick somebody who was his opposite. Obama had not been in Washington very long, so he picked somebody who was a creature of Washington, and Biden. Obviously, Obama is black, and so he picked Biden, who's not. And Harris did exactly the same thing. She picked her opposite. She picked a guy who fixes cars, who has a pretty, I'm sure it's a really sweet dog. It's not the most beautiful dog, Scout, and he's driving an old International Harvester Scout, SUV, right? This is not a San Francisco liberal.
Yeah. Do elected officials have a fundamental civic duty to open up to the press, open forum, no holds barred.
Oh, absolutely. As any journalist would tell you, they have that absolute obligation, and every politician would say, "Yeah, right." You know.
Yeah.
It's just, you know. I mean, I watched her interview on CNN the other night, and you know, it was fine. She did fine. But it was an event, and it shouldn't have been an event. In my view, she should have held forth, you know, before that and after that, and then it would not be such an event. That said, she's running in a very compressed period of time. There are certain things she can control, and everything that she can control, she will control. You know, I read David Plouffe's book when him being the campaign manager for Barack Obama in 2007 and 8, and he's nothing if not a control guy, and so, you know, when Simon Schuster asked me to write a new epilogue for Kamala's Way, which I was happy to do. And as soon as they asked me to write it, I sent an email to Harris's people, and I got no answer, right? I mean, they can't control what I'm going to write, and so everything they can control, they will control. And so, of course, they're going to limit her press access because they can't control what you and I ask. Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, and I think that they should do multiple interviews.
Because
They
the more you
certainly should
do,
talk
the
to
more
me.
relaxed, the less carefully guarded. Absolutely, I feel the same way. I mean, and and I say this as somebody who wants more transparency, not less. But you know, you look at a lot of California politicians, and they do not like to be taken off their notes. They resent you. They won't call you back next time.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's a whole other issue. But you know, the reality is that communication has changed. You know, I quit my last full-time paying job 4 years ago, and it's changed dramatically in 4 years. I don't think TikTok was around 4 years ago. You know, the whole concept of influencers. I mean, I was astonished at the Democratic National Convention, the access that influencers get as opposed to, I don't know, New York Times reporters, right? I mean, New York Times people do just fine.
Not just the convention, the Biden White House invited celebrity influencers over.
Right.
NATO has invited celebrity influencers onto our aircraft carriers. I mean,
Yes.
We're living in very strange times.
Yes. So you know, if I were a reporter at the Los Angeles Times or a columnist at the Sacramento Bee, I would think long and hard about what they're doing that I'm not doing and try to, you know, figure out a way into it. I mean, of course, we've got our standards and our ethics and you can't lose that, right? But you also have to figure a way to, you know, to be innovative and to get people to read what you're writing. And, you know, obviously she wants to get her message out, and if she thinks the best way to do that is to target a particular influencer who's got a particular audience of 1 million people, right? That's what she's going to do.
What advice would you give the political reporter who is covering Harris v. Trump? How do you think the game of coverage has changed since you were last in the thick of it? Well,
I think the rules are very different under Trump. I would find it really hard to cover Trump. Because he's just so outside the norms of any politician I've ever seen. Harris is a pretty mainstream Democrat who's running a race that is different from the last race that I was paying attention to, which was Trump versus Clinton. It's a very different race, but she still is a mainstream Democrat. This is not somebody who's outside the norm. She's just not. Trump is. He's a very different animal.
This person asks, please say a few words re the upcoming debate.
Well, Trump should never be underestimated. He is, he's a creature of the media, and he is, and he can be effective. She's a former courtroom attorney, and she's really quick on her feet. And again, having covered two of her debates, one of which I was a panelist on, she's really good in a debate. Now, I don't know how she'll be on September 10th. It's, she could have an off night. Who knows? Both these people are adept at performing in public. So I'll certainly be watching. Although I'm glad I'm not covering it.
You are. Interesting.
Yeah,
I was going to ask, does some part of you wish, you could just change the dials of time so that your career spanned what's happening now?
I'm really happy to have written a new epilogue to Kamala's Way, and having written the biography in 2010 or 2020 to have it published in 2021. No, that's fine with me. There are really a lot of excellent political reporters out there.
What's in that epilogue, or perhaps I should say, what do you wish, now that it's in the rearview mirror for you, what do you wish you were able to answer for yourself in the book that maybe you weren't able to?
Well, it's personal stuff. Like I say, her public record is her public record, and so that's all pretty accessible. But there are personal aspects of, just like what she thought. So she was a young deputy district attorney, first year, I think, in 1991, when there was this Senate hearing, confirmation of Clarence Thomas, and the chair of that Judiciary Committee was Joe Biden, and Anita Hill testified, and so young Kamala Harris must have had some thoughts about that, right? I have no idea what she thought. She's never said it. I think I would have read it somewhere. She didn't mention it in her autobiography. But I think that whatever was going through young Deputy District Attorney Kamala Harris's mind when she was watching that hearing, and she had to have been watching that hearing, because we all were. I think that's interesting. And then, that election night of 1992, election night, she's a young deputy DA, and she gets in her little Corolla and drives across the Bay Bridge and comes to the Fairmont Ballroom. I was there that night, and it was packed. And it was the night that Clinton ended 12 years of Republican control of the White House, and really importantly, the night that Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein were elected to the United States Senate. I would love to know what she was thinking of that night. Did she see herself up there? I don't know. I would ask give me 20 minutes with her, and there are really interesting answers that I think maybe I could elicit. I don't know. We'll see.
She's very successfully circumspect. She was circumspect even when she was young, and for sure now. But along those lines, somebody's asked, if you had the opportunity to interview Kamala Harris today, what are 3 things you would ask her?
Well, those are 2.
Yeah.
And a third is what you, like, I don't know when she had moved back here when Nelson Mandela spoke at the Oakland Coliseum. I would love to have known, I would love to know whether she went there and what she thought of that. I was there covering that day for the LA Times. It was an amazing event. And she would have been there. I'm curious to know about her relationship with her father, which is opaque. I don't know anything about it. He hasn't spoken except for one little comment during the 2019, her run in 2019. So I'm curious about that.
And that was going to be my next question, something personal, something non-political that might give us all insight into who she is, what her values really are. Because we can project onto her, we could say, well, these are the demographics, this is the time period, there's Berkeley, there's Oakland, right? Like there's San Francisco.
And Quebec, you can't.
And Quebec,
So
absolutely.
She was there from age 12 to 18. Well, that's a pretty formative time in any teenager's life.
Yeah, her university days. But those would just be projections.
Yeah. We don't, maybe she'll write about it when she gets around to doing a memoir, real memoir. This is the first biography. There will be, I have no doubt, but there are, great journalists in Washington who are already under contract to do the next biography of Kamala Harris, and I hope that there are some of the great presidential historians that are looking at this as well.
Are there any noticeable differences between Harris's early political days versus now?
I just think, having seen her in public settings when she was running in California and seen her on the stage in D.C., at the DNC, at the Democratic National Convention in Las Vegas. I just think she's gotten better. She's more at ease. I think her acceptance speech was terrific. I think it was, just from a theater reviewer's point of view, it was a well-delivered speech. Whether you agree with her or not, she's performing well as a character in this election. So I think, anyways.
There's a passage in the book where you talk about, I believe it was the same DNC where Barack Obama gave his great speech, and she was reading off words, blah, 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 that somebody else had written, right. And it fell flat. The crowd was talking amongst themselves. They lost interest right away, and, but what I really took from that passage was the idea that so much depends on the people around you, the team around you. And, obviously this book stops a few years back, but what is your sense of the team that she has around her going into this election?
Well, I think the team that she had in 2021 when Biden first took office and she was vice president was not her team. And it was a team picked by the Biden White House. And so that was a recipe for conflict, and there was a ton of turnover. And you read the stories in Politico, the New York Times did a story in December of 2021 about turnover and how there was a disarray in the vice president's office. Well, part of it was she didn't have her own people there. She didn't have people who particularly knew her. And I think that now, well, I think that the decision in Dobbs was really the public turning point. I think the internal turning point happened before Dobbs. But once the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, she had an issue, and right at that time, the opinion comes out in June of 2022. President Biden didn't say much, and she was on Air Force Two flying to an event in Illinois, and she read the opinion on the plane and got off the plane and scrapped the remarks she was going to make and talked about Dobbs and the meaning and significance of that. Well, she became the spokesperson for the Biden-Harris White House on that really important issue, which clearly affected the 2022 election, and I think will be pivotal in 2024. I mean, as much as Trump tries to dance around this issue, he did appoint 3 of the justices who voted to overturn Roe versus Wade. I don't think you can get around that. I don't see how you could get around that. Maybe he can. He has shown himself to be a pretty adept politician, whether you agree with him or not.
Any questions? I'm going to ask you something here that, I usually ask people who are not savvy political reporters, but is there a question that I've failed to ask today that you really want to be asked, you want to answer about this book, or perhaps, other interviews, or they're just failing to ask that question that you want to ask?
No, there really isn't. I mean, you've done a really good job of asking.
I'm fishing for compliments. That's what's happening here. Yeah.
Of asking good questions. She is a very interesting politician. I just remember the time in 2010 when that Republican campaign committee, which Karl Rove was involved in, and his partner Ed Gillespie was involved in. So these are really high-profile, really smart political minds, decided to spend $1 million to knock off Kamala Harris before she could win. And, I think today they probably wish they had succeeded. Maybe put $2 million into that ad buy. So.
I want to give great thanks to you, Dan Morain, author of Kamala's Way and American Life. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Dan's book here or at your local bookstore. And if you'd like to support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit the website www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Rachel Myrow. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.